watching Reason and Theology Live. The show concentrates on theological topics, historical matters, and philosophical problems with content ranging from introductory material to in-depth examinations. And now, your host, Michael Lofton.
Welcome back to Reason and Theology, everyone. Your host, Michael, on a Tuesday. Hope everybody had a good New Year's. We're getting back into the swing of things here with a very, very special guest. Somebody I greatly admire. I think he's an excellent theologian, and I think he also comes from a unique perspective, and that is from somebody who converted from Judaism to Catholicism. And what we're doing today, we've had him on the show, of course, before, Dr. Feingold, but what we're doing this time is going over his conversion story. In fact, I have not heard it, so it's going to be new for me. So I'm really looking forward to this. But first, welcome to the show, Dr. Feingold.
Thank you so much for having me again.
Yeah, honored to have you. I think this is fourth or fifth show, one of those. Yeah, somewhere around there. Like I said, I haven't heard your conversion story. I know clearly that you went from Judaism to Catholicism. I don't know really any details if you practice Judaism or anything like that. So go ahead and just start us with the very beginning.
Okay. Yeah. So no, actually, the conversion was more from atheism. So I was raised as a Jewish atheist. So my dad was a Jewish atheist, physicist, and somewhat militant in his atheism. He had been bar mitzvahed when he was 13. But after that, he kind of renounced the faith. Whereas my grandparents came from Lithuania and Belarus about the turn of about 1900, fleeing from the pogroms in Russia. And and so they came to New York in about 1900. And my mom was a fallen away Protestant. And so when I grew up, my parents didn't practice any faith. We would very occasionally go to a Unitarian church. And that was the extent of our religious upbringing. I remember going a few times to Sunday school at the Unitarian church, and we learned some astronomy. But,
astronomy, that's pretty odd.
But that was about it. So, my wife is also, she practiced Judaism. So she was Jewish in a much more serious sense than I was. Yeah. And we met at college at Washington University. And I'm going to come back to Washington University in a minute. So she grew up in a conservative Jewish home, but both of her parents also were Jewish atheists. And her mother, a Holocaust survivor. So that's my mother-in-law, who still lives here in St. Louis, and we see her very frequently. Yeah, so she was born in 1938 in Warsaw, and
she was in Warsaw.
Yeah, so her family escaped east to the Soviet Union. Yeah, and survived the war in the Soviet Union, where my wife's grandfather worked for the Red Army as a tailor, and so my mother-in-law has earliest memories of long train rides in Soviet Union.
Well, was she in a concentration camp?
No, never. She was. They fled west after the war, and then they were in an Allied a displaced persons camp, which was a very good place to be at that time.
Yeah.
And that was in West Germany.
Okay.
Poland first, and then Germany, and then they finally came to this country in the 50s.
Okay. I see. Wow, I bet that's fascinating, though, having conversations with her.
But anyway, so I had no religious upbringing, but the first movement towards the faith came from an unlikely source, I would suppose, an art history class at Washington University. So I wanted to be an artist, and I was doing sculpture and above all sculpture. And we had to take in freshman year a required class, Art and Civilization, which was fantastic. And I just fell in love with this class. And the professor was a very devout, I think, Presbyterian. Although, he didn't tell us that directly, but it soon became evident. First day of class, this is 200 freshmen, 18 years old, and he showed us two paintings, a Rembrandt portrait and an abstract expressionist Woman Number 4 by Willem de Kooning, The Sound and the Fury. And he asked us, if we were on our deathbed, which painting would we want to have over our beds to contemplate? And so I was making things like Woman Number 4 at that time, and I, doing abstract expressionist kinds of art. But I knew I wouldn't want to have that over my bed. I didn't want to have the Rembrandt because of the dignity of the human person. Right? And that, I mean, it manifests the idea. I couldn't have put it in words, but made in the image and likeness of God. And so that was the beginning. He in this Art and Civilization, kind of took us through art with this perspective that in looking at a work of art, always look for the conviction about the meaning of life or worldview that the work of art is manifesting. And then the idea that truth and beauty go together. And so ultimately, the beauty of a work of art has to do with the truth of the worldview in it. I thought he didn't maybe say it so directly as that. That's what I got from the course. And so it made a huge impact on me. I didn't immediately stop doing abstract expressionist kind of art, but I started spending much more time contemplating Christian art and fell in love with Christian art. And I wanted to do it, but I couldn't find any place to study it. So the art program at Washington University was very modernistic at that time, actually postmodern, I suppose, but super realism. And so I wanted to study Christian art, but I couldn't find a place to do so. So I decided to do a master's in art history. And now so let me take a step back. And before that, my wife and I, and before we got married, we were spent a year in Germany. I'm sorry, I'm giving you, is this too many details?
No, this is perfect.
And so in that time, we spent about 6 weeks traveling through Europe. So we went to Paris at Christmas time, and we were in Notre Dame and Chartres Cathedral on Christmas Day. And I just remember Chartres was empty because it was lunchtime, except for monks chanting the divine office. Right, the second was. But we came out of the church still atheists, but we're deeply moved by lots of things we saw. So then after that, we studied art history in Columbia in New York for 3 years, and they happened to have a stone sculpture course. So I fell in love with stone sculpture. And people said, well, if you want to do stone sculpture, you have to go to Italy. And so we actually ended up living for 3 years in Pietrasanta, Italy, which is a sculptor's town in Tuscany, and just north of Pisa and south of Carrara, where the marbles poured. And it's an international sculptors community. And so we spent 3 years, and I spent 2 years making a statue of my wife, a standing nude of her. And we had a lot of time to think about the world. So she must have spent 1,000 hours probably posing for this. And she would read books out loud, and we got to think, and we would go to Florence every weekend and other places to see great works of art, like Michelangelo, Donatello, Bernini, and we'd leave when there was a mass. But about 2 years into that, I remember one time I was in St. Peter's, in the Sistine Chapel, and it just hit me. And here we all are, and everybody's taking pictures of the Last Judgment, and tons of tourists, and it hit me. Nobody's asking, is it true? And what would Michelangelo think about our admiring, right, the Last Judgment for its aesthetic qualities, when he painted it for the cardinals to think about their judgment when they voted, right, for the election of the Pope. Anyway, so that hit me that I was, that was the first insight from that art history class. Truth and beauty go together. How can I be admiring the beauty of this divorced from its truth and divorced from the question, where will I stand on that day? So that was disturbing. And at this time, my wife was pregnant with our son, our only child. And that too was, that's very often for people, I think, a time in which you pose questions that up until then you had dismissed. And I remember thinking, what am I going to teach our child about the meaning of life? I recognized I didn't have something, a conviction to pass on. And then a little later in the pregnancy, my wife got some very profound anxiety about the pregnancy. about 6 months in. And so one day she said she didn't want to live. She didn't mean it. She doesn't even remember that. But I thought she meant it. And that was actually the most important thing in our conversion. So it hit me that day. I wasn't able to love her the way she needed to be loved. And that I wanted to run away from this problem. And then secondly, it hit me that if life wouldn't make sense if there wasn't someone who could love her perfectly, who could fill that, all right, I wouldn't put it like that then, that God hole in her. In other words, that I could see that there was a need for love in her heart, and others as well, although I was seeing it in her, and that is for an unlimited love, right? And I couldn't do that. And so it hit me that day that life didn't make sense if there isn't God the Father who loves us in that way. And that whole process of kind of artistic conversion that I've been going through for 10 years at this point, I'd be back with de Kooning, the sound and the fury meaning nothing. And that love for the human being made in the image of that sense of human dignity in the great works of Christian art would ultimately be false. Anyway, so it just hit me that day. God the Father has to exist to love her in that way, and I have to ask him to teach me to love. And I'd never prayed in my life. Right? So I was 29. So I thought, all right, I'm going to go to the Duomo in Florence. So I got in the train and was on my way to Florence. It was about an hour. And about halfway there, I felt moved to pray by the Holy Spirit. Recognized later, teach me to love and to be a light unto others. So that was the first time I prayed in my life. And after that, I felt the words of Psalm number 2. All right, let me say something. Although I never sat down to read scripture for piety, it was required for art history. And so, especially studying Renaissance art, you have to know the New Testament. So I knew enough of it from cultural reasons so that could come into my heart. You are my son. This day I've begotten you. From Psalm 2, or from the baptism of Christ, you are my son in whom I'm well pleased. So that came into my mind, and I understood that was being said to Jesus and to us, right? So my wife, myself, in him. And because I left him out of the picture altogether, right? I had thought the day before about God the Father loving us in this way. And I was going to go to a church to pray, but I hadn't thought of Jesus at all. But after that experience, yes, I believed. And there was, so people later would ask me, why did you choose to become Christian and not rather Jewish? Well, I think most converts have this experience. It's not a choice. It's you come to see something that you hadn't seen before. And it's a matter of not resisting the light that's been given. So I did end up going to the Duomo in Florence, and remember being very uncomfortable kneeling for the first time in my life and thinking what people think. And so I came back and I told my wife about it. And so for a couple of weeks, we had a kind of tug of war. Now, she also wanted to believe, when we first met, she at college, her papers, history and philosophy, she'd always capitalize truth and beauty and goodness. And so that's very often an atheist is seeking God, right, in that way, right, with the capitalized T of truth and goodness. And so she wanted to believe, but she didn't want to believe irresponsibly or irrationally. So about 10 days later, we decided we'd go to the local parish to pray before Mass. Then we were going to leave it when Mass started. And it just so happened that our local parish was a Romanesque, small, but a Romanesque church in Italy from the 10th century. And it was beautiful. And so we went there before Mass, and we were going to leave. And just as we were leaving, our landlady came in, who we loved. And I thought she was, just like most Italians, non-practicing. And she was even more amazed to see us than we were to see her Feingold, what are you doing here? So we stayed, and it was so that was our first mass. It was so moving. It was the fourth Sunday of Easter and Good Shepherd Sunday, and it was also Vocation Sunday. And so it was a short homily that the priest gave on the Christian vocation, the married vocation, the priestly vocation, and both of us were very moved in this mass in different ways. For me, the most moving was probably the communion. Again, I didn't know anything about the Eucharist, but there was something about when the people were going up to receive communion, and especially the woman sitting next to me, this old woman sitting next to me, and somehow I could feel her faith, and she received, and that some sense of the mystical body of the communion. That, and I found out later she was a woman of great faith. She had been cured she was a hunchback and had been cured in Lourdes some 20 years earlier. But in any case, so that was our first mass, and so we started to go to weekly mass at this church, but we didn't understand anything about Catholic or Protestant at this time. But we were aided in all kinds of ways. So first of all, being in Catholic Italy, and then shortly thereafter, there came Corpus Christi. So that seeing the Eucharistic procession was very moving. But even more striking was in the month of May, it was 1988, a Marian year, and there was a Marian procession in our town, because our cathedral had a painting of Our Lady that had been attributed saving the city from plague, or I forget, plague or some natural disaster in the 17th century. And so they were processing with the painting, and the Archbishop of Pisa and various priests and the faithful and praying the rosary. So this is our first kind of, maybe our second introduction to popular piety, and here Marian devotion. And the Archbishop of Pisa ended up preaching a novena of masses on the role of Mary in salvation history. The first one, Mary as the new Eve. That was totally, so I didn't understand what you were saying, but that really spoke to me. So we hadn't been baptized yet, but so those were, and the third experience was I was by myself in St. Peter's about a month later, and I was walking down the main, the nave, and I saw on my right these two angels by Bernini that I'd studied in art history and always wanted to see. And you probably know what they are, the Adoration Chapel. But I didn't know that. And so I go into the Adoration Chapel to see these Bernini angels, and I felt the breath knocked out of me as I entered the chapel. And I look around, and there's a monstrance, and there are people adoring. And I guess I knew enough of it. So I went in and was moved I was very moved by that experience in a kind of visceral way. But at the same time, growing up even as an atheist in the U.S., there's so much Protestantism in the air that so there was a tug of war happening in me at this time between kind of Catholic and Protestant, and the Catholic part was kind of obvious because I'd fallen in love with Catholic culture and with its deep roots and in the medieval and patristic period, but I didn't know that, so I would go back like week by week, Catholic, Protestant, and I would notice that when I thought we should be Protestant, there was something sad about that, but I couldn't put my finger on it. But the reason again being that that idea of a Catholic culture that was somehow one, and anyway. We ended up talking to an Anglican priest in Florence who was overjoyed that a family came to him from atheism, Jewish atheists. And so he gave us a whole stack of books, and he took it really seriously, much more seriously than the Catholic priest that we spoke to. And interestingly enough, one of the books that this Anglican priest gave us was a classic, Abandonment to Divine Providence. Who's the author?
Caussade.
Yeah, that's right.
Jean-Pierre Caussade, I think.
Yeah. So that book, again, totally changed the way I looked at the world. So it also goes by the title, The Sacrament of the Present Moment, I think.
I've heard that before. Yeah.
And that's kind of the main idea, is that every ordinary life has a sacramental quality in which God's will is made apparent to us in the events of ordinary life. All right, if you're an atheist, you don't think that, right? In other words, what happens is just chance. And so seeing a providential meaning in the events of ordinary life was a total change in the way that we looked at the world. So that had a big impact. And then he gave me some other books from the Oxford movement, not by Newman, but by his best friend Pusey, which I liked very much. And then A History of the Reformation, which I hated because, again, of that idea of tearing down the altars. But we ended up getting baptized in the Anglican Church about 5 or 6 months into our conversion in Florence. But having a bad conscience about it, although I couldn't explain it. But part of it was the conversion was such a powerful experience. I felt moved to I felt called to lay aside sculpture and to take up theology. So I was spending all my time reading theology at this time. So our son was born and he was baptized with us. He was 3 months old when we got baptized. And so I knew that as an Anglican, one could be an Anglican priest and be married. So that was kind of my thought. And we ended up writing to the Episcopalian Bishop of New York and decided to go back to New York. And we got confirmed in the Anglican Church before we left. But right at this time, just before we left, we would browse in the British Library in Florence. And this time, one of the books that called out to me, in other words, I saw this book, The Newman Reader, and I just knew very generally, he's a great writer, Oxford Movement, maybe that's all I could have said. And I picked it up and it just spoke to me very deeply. So when we got back to the US, I got his essay on the development of Christian doctrine that he wrote during his conversion, and then his autobiography, Apologia Pro Vita Sua. And so I kind of devoured those books, and that was it for staying Anglican. And so at this time, Marcia was in St. Louis visiting her parents, and I was in New York, and I had to call her on the phone. Marcia, I think we should become Catholic. And there was kind of a silence there for a minute. But then she did the Ruth move, Ruth and Naomi, where you go, I will go. And so it wasn't a problem. We entered the RCA. I asked to enter RCA in December 8th, 1988. And we ended up entering the Catholic Church and be confirmed on the Easter Vigil, March 25th, 1989. So that was, yeah. Wow. So that was our conversion. And at this time, I wanted to study theology. And so another piece of this was we kind of didn't know about different currents in the church and theological conflict or problems. But I started studying at the local seminary, and I found out that there I was troubled by some of the things being taught there.
Yeah,
as a new convert, and confused, but it ended up being a very good experience, because it was a vocational experience as well. So I got the sense that I had to get formed in theology well, so as to teach my hope was to teach in a seminary and to pass on doctrine in a better way.
So you had that interest in studying theology, I think you said, when you were an Anglican, and that just carried over into your days as a Catholic. So, excuse me. So when you converted, did you kind of know that you were going to go the theological professor route?
Yeah, that was my goal, my hope anyway.
Yeah,
it ended up being a long road. Yeah.
So you ended up working on. So I assume you didn't have formal theological training prior.
No, I didn't have any. Yes, I didn't have any. I just had an art history master's and a comparative arts bachelor's. And it was interesting. It was through a Protestant that I was kind of telling her about my problems with the theology I was learning at the seminary. And she said, well, you can't figure this out. Don't think you can figure it out yourself. Right? That would be the Protestant way. You need a mentor. You need a guide. I'm going to look for something for you. And so a couple weeks later, she came back and she told me about, well, she asked me if I heard of Opus Dei. And I guess I'd heard the name, but didn't know too much about it. Her husband was a fallen away Catholic who had a roommate who was an Opus Dei numerary. And so he came out to our house and told us about the university they have in Spain. We didn't know Spanish, but that they were founding one in Rome. And that was the Pontifical, at that time, Athenaeum of the Holy Cross. And so we knew it. We knew Italian. We lived in Italy for 3 years. So we decided to go there. And so we ended up living in Rome for 8 years. So it was a 9-year course of study at Santa Croce. So when we first got there, I was hoping, because I was already 31 or 2, I guess. And I was hoping that could be done more quickly. But the first day I got there, I talked to the academic dean, and he said, well, it's a 9-year course, and 2 years of philosophy, 3 years of theology for the bachelor's, 2 years more for the license of theology, and 2 years more for the doctorate. And you'll thank me at the end. And so I got this splitting migraine headache, but I ended up, yes, very much thanking him at the end.
So how did you get into, I mean, I don't want to assume, how did you get into content dealing with the Messiah and especially finding Christ in the Old Testament? Since you came from this atheistic background, what prompted you to that?
Okay, so I had to rediscover, great question. I had to rediscover the Jewish heritage that I didn't receive growing up. And so that, I just felt drawn to things Jewish. And this is a rather common experience I've seen with other Hebrew Catholics who came from a very minimally Jewish upbringing or family. That there's a hunger to rediscover those roots and a passion about it, and a sense of belonging. I mean, that to that family and to that heritage. Of course, we all do, right, spiritually. But there's another sense in which one can connect through one's family to that whole back to Abraham. So we had to do that afterwards. And part of that. My wife and I ended up living for a year in Jerusalem.
Oh, okay.
In the middle of this, after I got the bachelor's, I was thinking of doing a doctorate in scripture. And so I studied at the Franciscan Studium Biblicum Franciscanum in Jerusalem. So that was wonderful to live for a whole year, to learn modern Hebrew and to learn biblical Hebrew. So we ended up living in the Christian Arab quarter, about a 10-minute walk from the Holy Sepulchre, and went there for mass every morning.
Yeah, I lived about 10 minutes from there as well. I know it was, from what I was told, it was 10 minutes, but I don't remember exactly which street or anything. But wow, that's pretty cool. See, you got to live there as an adult, though. I was there as a child, so I didn't get to appreciate it like you did. So I'm a little envious. So you got to study with the Franciscans over there in Jerusalem. How was that? What was the formation like there? I'm just curious.
Yeah, it was excellent for things like biblical archaeology, language, history. But I felt starved for systematic theology and St. Thomas Aquinas. And so I decided after a year to go back to Rome and to do my license and doctorate in dogmatic theology rather than in. But it was a good. They're excellent at what they focused on, kind of the also Jewish prayer and so I benefited a lot from it. But it wasn't for me ultimately.
Yeah, right. Okay. So I'm kind of curious, once you made this move to, well, I guess it would apply even to when you went the Anglican route, but once you made the move to Christianity, did you get any pushback from family members who are Jewish that don't agree with Christianity?
I didn't get so much from my dad because he was, simply because his, the way he put it was this: I've always preached tolerance, and now I'm going to have to live it. But he ended up putting money in our bank account without my asking him year after year for me to study theology in Rome. And so we had this, and then the year after we entered the church, my mother entered the church, and I was her sponsor in RCA. So that was really beautiful. My father didn't do that, but he became much more open in his last years.
Yeah.
He kind of, when he had a little Alzheimer's, he kind of forgot that he was a militant atheist.
Yeah. So, I mean, others, maybe non-family members, did they start to...
On my wife's side, sure. Yeah. So they took her to a counselor, and but again, they've been very supportive. So others have suffered much more from.
Well, yeah. Did that make you want to dive deeper into the Christian roots of Judaism?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So that's been
I guess it's the way the Jewish roots of Christianity.
Jewish roots. Yeah. So that's one of my, I mean, theology as a whole, but a beautiful aspect of theology is precisely the divine pedagogy, how God prepared for the fullness, the incarnation in Israel. So Israel as a mystery.
Yeah, and you have a really good series on that. In fact, that's how I found out about you. Is the lectures and the material that you have with the Hebrew Catholics. When I was looking into Catholicism, I was trying to find out the Catholic perspective on Judaism, and then I came across that material and dove into your books that deal with typology in the Old Testament, because I already was very interested in typology, just because I noticed that that's a theme that was there with the church fathers, and I was interested in the fathers. So when I saw that, I really appreciated your work. So it was very, very helpful and very interesting. And I think it also fills a gap. I can't really say that there are a whole lot of people who are really addressing that area.
Yeah, much more now than maybe 50 years ago. Obviously, Brand Petrie, Scott.
Oh, yeah.
They do great work in that, and I draw a lot from them.
Yeah, they have excellent stuff. So, so you make your way into the church, you study to be a theologian and become a professor. What are some of the things that you can maybe say, looking back on your experiences? What are maybe some pieces of advice you could give to others who are perhaps, atheists, who are Jewish, who are considering Catholicism or practicing Judaism? What was some advice you could give?
Wow. So I don't have that much, unfortunately, I wish I did, experience with practicing, but I'd have to think a little about that.
Yeah. Well, maybe for those who are kind of in the same situation, they're not practicing Judaism,
right?
They're atheists. What's some advice maybe there?
Well, so my route wasn't the, so was end up discovering scripture afterwards.
Yeah.
But everybody has a different way of getting to it. So for me, in some sense, it was seeing. Pope Benedict has some great writings on the role of beauty, and so that was the particular way that we went, the role of beauty, and so in our particular case, it was the patrimony of beauty that the faith inspired as a sign of its truth, and part of that beauty is, in fact, it's the fact that it includes the word of revelation from the beginning, right? So whether it's maybe it's easier to see in music. So Gregorian chant has deep roots in the worship of Israel, right? In many ways, it's that's its proper source. With regard to, for me, it was more the visual arts, and you see that less, right? That immediate connection with Israel. But in the part of, so you spoke about typology, the art of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance is so steeped in typology. And so it's an image of the biblical world that includes the Old Testament as well. That's not a proper answer to your question.
I've noticed that, though, when I look at illuminated manuscripts from the medieval period, you'll see a lot of typology in the visuals on the manuscripts that, you know, are it's some kind of scene from the Old Testament, but it's depicting something in the New Testament. Yeah, you'll come across that a lot.
Yeah. So going back to your question, when I'm again, I didn't have this experience because I wasn't connected enough with the Jewish world or with, but there have been an interesting convert from Judaism of the 20th century is the former chief rabbi of Rome, Zoli. I think it's a really interesting book, Before the Dawn, in which he tells about his kind of experience. And his experience was really a lifelong growth and attraction over 50 years. And he tells about his first experience was being in the home of a childhood friend of his who was Catholic, Stanislaus, and there was a crucifix on the wall. And he kind of wondering, why do you have a crucified man on your wall? And then when it was explained to him, it was the witness of the mother of his friend who practiced charity together with his mother, and they would do works of almsgiving. And so it planted the question, is it, is the figure of, say, the suffering servant of Isaiah, is Jesus that or not? And he left it an open question, basically for 50 years. And he would pray, obviously, principally with the Old Testament, but also with the New as well, even before coming fully to faith. Yeah, so that would be my advice in that regard.
There's a question here in the chat. Topper is asking, what do you say to someone who thinks postmodern art is beautiful?
Well, there are. I wouldn't categorically reject that.
Yeah.
I do think, though, that in general, whether the art of the 20th century, and now I'm a little out of the, not so up on what's happening most recently, does do very well at depicting alienation. And that's not, obviously, there are other aspects of modernist and postmodernist art that are more positive. But so that too can have a positive function. In other words, precisely a cry of anguish that shows that there's a problem, right? That comes from the loss. Art has a profoundly social nature, and there are tons of believers who are artists, but it's hard to do an art in a society that's largely post-Christian. It's much, much harder as an artist. Now, I do welcome, sure, there are aspects of postmodern art that are newly open to the tradition. That wasn't the case in the time of modernism. And obviously, that's a very good thing. And you see that in architecture and in other aspects of the arts as well. So that can be positive. But the danger is very often it's a play with forms without a deep conviction about truth. And so that would be the kind of the danger there.
Rocket Man asks, do you think modern Catholics should educate themselves more on Catholicism's Jewish roots? Do you think that it would help with some modern church problems?
Totally. Yes. It's the divine pedagogy. God's plan for the church coming to the his plan for revelation has to be the blueprint for our appropriation of it. I don't know, and I think this was so for me. And the theology of Ratzinger is really a beautiful kind of example of this, of centering on salvation history. And even though he doesn't perhaps do as much Jewish roots as people like Petrie or Hahn, it's that biblical perspective. I think that's crucial for us to recover. And so I love St. Thomas as well, right? And in his day, Thomas Aquinas, in the 13th century, you had to do both things. You had to comment on sacred scripture and do systematic theology, right? To be a master of theology. And we've kind of lost that. And I think it's really important to put those two things together. And then, yeah, I think it's an antidote for all kinds of questions as well regarding liturgy. Think of, Israel had a very high liturgy. And that has to be, obviously, the new covenant. We've got the reality of which they had the shadow, right? So that's Hebrews 8 through 10. But it, in many ways, is a model for, even though we have so in Hebrews, we have the icon. Israel had the shadow, but the heavenly liturgy is the real thing, right? And so the liturgy has to be an arrow pointing to that. So
Dr. Declue asks, when I heard the importance of beauty and art from you, it seemed to me that you would be at home most in the Communio school, but you're most well known for arguing against de Lubac. What are your thoughts about this?
Great question. Thank you. So I actually, there are works of de Lubac that I greatly admire. And that is, above all, his Catholicism and then his medieval exegesis. I think those are masterpieces.
Oh, yeah.
And have done great good. The work that I was picking on in my dissertation was his Surnaturel and Mystery of the Supernatural. And I just simply think he didn't, I appreciate his general orientation very much, but I think that he, in a kind of zeal to have a more biblical kind of theology, I think he was unjust to the neo-Thomistic tradition a bit. And so that's kind of what I was arguing against in my thesis. So I don't think he got it quite right about the natural desire to see God. That's a technical question. I could go a lot further on that, but
some man 7 asks, please, if you can suggest a Bible reading plan, one that hopefully brings out the old and the new.
I don't have anything particular. I mean, my Bible reading plan is above all following the daily readings.
Yeah.
I think the liturgically oriented Bible reading plan is the best, just so that we're in sync with the liturgical cycle. If there's time, I could go back to that previous question about.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
So I appreciate the fact that he highlights so strongly the natural desire to see God, and that. So I'm with him entirely on that. What I was criticizing is he thought he saw in the neo kind of scholastic tradition, the Thomistic tradition, the origins of modern atheism. And I just don't think that's right at all. I think that the origins of modern atheism consisted in basically a rejection of Catholic culture, including very much a Thomistic kind of distinction. In other words, de Lubac was against a separation of nature and grace. But in the Thomistic tradition, you get the distinction in a greater analogical unity. And so that's what I was trying to defend there in my thesis, which is the natural desire to see God according to St. Thomas Aquinas and his interpreters. But yes, I do appreciate the Communio school in general.
Thunder Thumbs asks, can you explain more as to how Gregorian chant is rooted in the Jewish hymns or sacred music?
Yeah, we don't know. Tragically, the history of music is harder to reconstruct than the history of art, because we don't have that standard notation that goes back. So a lot of this is hypothetical reconstruction. But it's reasonable to think, and it's been well argued, that the origin of Gregorian chant would have been the chant of the synagogue. And I forget the name of there are historians of music who've, I think, demonstrated that.
Jess asks, you speak about the beauty of something pointing to truth of something. How does that apply to hell? Universal salvation sounds more beautiful than damnation.
Great question. So let me take a step back. And I think it's really, so beauty, that was my route to the faith. And I think beauty plays an important part. So the positive aspect of the objection, I agree with entirely. And I think it's important to use beauty in doing theology. And I do that, they're technically called arguments of fittingness. An argument of fittingness would be a kind of argument showing that what God has revealed is in fact wise and beautiful and profoundly satisfying and in accordance with human nature and the cosmos, etc. So that would be the way I would approach this question. And when you do an argument of fittingness, you start with what God has revealed. And what God has revealed is that there's a judgment. And in this judgment, eternal life is at stake. And so in doing an argument of fittingness, you give the benefit of the doubt. Obviously, that's not the right word. You give the adherence of faith to what God has revealed, and then you look for the wisdom and beauty of it. And the beauty of it isn't obviously hell. Hell is just simply the ultimate ugliness, right? Because it's the rejection of God, who is beauty, and so hell is ugliness. But human responsibility is what's beautiful, right? And so basically what Revelation reveals here is that the drama of human life, right? That God has wanted to, so it's the beauty of participation. It's that God, who is infinite everything, right? Infinite beauty, truth, and goodness, he makes a world maximizing those qualities, and therefore giving a true participation to us in getting to our end. All right, so God has freely willed for us a supernatural end, infinitely above our own level, right? To share in his beatitude, to share in his life for eternity. But he wants us to be real participants in attaining it, right? And that's really the meaning of this life here on earth. Otherwise, he could simply have made his rational creatures already having the beatific vision. There would have been in that case, there would be no hell, but there would be no trial and no real participation in acquiring it. And so the good of that participation in acquiring it is what's beautiful. And that entails the beauty, again, of freely choosing to adhere to it, though we don't see it. In other words, precisely in the darkness of faith. And that is what makes possible a potential failure and thus hell. And so hell itself is not beautiful, but the human dignity of making us real participants in getting there is what's beautiful. Great question.
One more. D. Wong asks, what is the coolest thing you've learned from theology that you want to share with the audience?
There's no way you can answer that question. But all theology is about the mystery of Jesus Christ. That's everything. And how, maybe tying it back to what we said earlier about typology, a beautiful thing about theology is how Christ recapitulates everything. Right? So that's Ephesians chapter 1. Saint Irenaeus of Lyon makes that kind of the center of his theology. Christ recapitulates everything that's come before him. That's all typology. He's then the archetype and model of the Christian life. That would be the moral sense of Scripture. and then he's the model of the life of eternity, the anagogical sense. And so that image, I think, of Christ recapitulating all reality and being the center of the biblical senses and of the Christian life, maybe that would be how I would answer that.
Thank you so much for this, Dr. Feingold. This was really a unique perspective, talking about your conversion here that was really influenced by art and Christian culture. I really appreciate that perspective. It's definitely different than what you tend to hear, which is more apologetic. So I really appreciate that. And, tell our viewers and listeners a little bit more about where they can go to learn more about you. Any websites where you do your lectures and stuff like that you want to point them to?
Okay, yeah, there's a website, the Association of Hebrew Catholics. So if you just Google Association Hebrew Catholics, it'll come up. And I've got a whole series of free lecture series. I think there's 17 or 18. And I'm doing one currently on Christology every other Sunday. And the information would be on that website. And they're all free.
And I'll put links to those in the description. So
and then there are books by Emmaus Academic.
Mm-hmm. And we've done interviews on each one of those books. So I'll also put links for those as well, because Dr. Feingold goes into, parts of those books and kind of gives you a sneak peek. So it was good stuff. Dr. Feingold, you're always welcome on the show. Thank you so much for coming on and doing this.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's an honor. Everybody, thank y'all for watching. Great questions there. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Also check us out, patreon.com/Reason and Theology if you want to support what we're doing here. We'll see y'all later.